I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law pointed at the small folding table in the corner and said, "Kids' table is over there, Margaret." It was Thanksgiving evening, the kind of cold November night where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and roasted turkey, and the windows of Daniel's suburban house glowed warmly against the early darkness. I had arrived with a homemade pumpkin pie balanced carefully on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan, the same car I'd been driving since my husband passed away 6 years ago. The driveway was already full of shiny SUVs and polished pickup trucks, most of them belonging to Ashley's side of the family. Inside, laughter filled the dining room, glasses clinked, and the long oak table was set with china that looked suspiciously newer and nicer than the dishes I remembered helping Daniel buy years ago. Ashley barely looked at me when I walked in. She was arranging napkins with precise little folds, smiling brightly at everyone else. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice cheerful but thin, the way it often was around me. Then she glanced toward the far corner of the room where a small plastic table had been set up beside the window. 3 booster seats, cartoon placemats, and one empty chair clearly meant for me. "Adults are sitting here tonight," Ashley added lightly, gesturing to the main table. "So you can join the kids." For a moment I thought she was joking. Daniel was standing nearby pouring cider into glasses, but he didn't meet my eyes. Instead he stared down into the pitcher as if the apple cider required his full attention. My grandson Tyler waved at me happily from the little table. "Grandma, sit by me," he said, swinging his legs under the chair. I smiled back because children should never feel awkward about grown-up problems. So I carried my coat to the hallway rack, set the pumpkin pie beside the others on the kitchen counter, and walked quietly over to the kids' table. The chair creaked when I sat down. From where I was sitting I could see the adults' table perfectly. Crystal glasses. Candlelight. Ashley laughing as she placed Daniel at the head of the table like he was hosting a television cooking show instead of a family dinner. Nobody looked toward the corner where I sat except Tyler, who was busy explaining to me why dinosaurs would definitely beat sharks in a fight. I nodded and listened, the way grandmothers do. Still, something about the room felt strange tonight. Not just the seating arrangement. The air held a kind of nervous electricity, like people were waiting for something to happen. Ashley kept glancing toward the living room. Daniel checked his watch twice in 5 minutes. At exactly 7:02 p.m., the television mounted on the wall in the next room flickered on. The volume rose suddenly, loud enough for the whole house to hear. A news anchor's voice echoed through the hallway. "Tonight," the man said, calm and clear, "we finally reveal the identity of the anonymous donor who has quietly funded more than 4,000 college scholarships across the United States." Conversations at the dinner table slowed. Someone laughed awkwardly. I felt my hands grow still in my lap. On the screen, a photograph faded into view. It was an old picture, taken nearly 20 years ago, back when my hair was still mostly brown and my classroom chalkboard stood behind me. And beneath that photograph, in bold white letters across the bottom of the screen, appeared a name I had spent 2 decades trying very hard to keep private. My name. The room did not go silent all at once. It happened slowly, like the moment when a conversation fades because people suddenly realize they are hearing something important. Forks stopped moving. Someone lowered a glass onto the table with a soft click. From the children's table I could see every face turn toward the living room television. The news anchor continued speaking in that steady voice reporters use when they are announcing something significant but do not want to sound emotional about it. "For more than 20 years," he said, "this donor has quietly supported students across the country, funding scholarships, libraries, and community education programs without ever revealing her identity." I felt Tyler tug gently at the sleeve of my sweater. "Grandma," he whispered, pointing toward the screen. "That looks like you." On the television the photograph lingered for a few seconds longer. It was a picture taken during my final year teaching at Lincoln Middle School in Cedar Ridge. I remembered the day clearly. Someone from the local newspaper had visited to write a small article about our reading program. I had never expected that photograph to appear on national television 2 decades later. At the adults' table, Ashley leaned forward slightly, squinting toward the screen as if trying to convince herself she was mistaken. Daniel finally looked up from his glass. His expression changed slowly, confusion first, then recognition. The news anchor continued. Margaret Collins, a retired public school teacher from Cedar Ridge, spent 2 decades using her savings and private investments to create what is now known as the Collins Education Fund. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. The children beside me had stopped talking about dinosaurs and were now staring openly at the television. The room felt smaller somehow, the warm glow of Thanksgiving candles replaced by the bright reflection of the television screen across the polished dining table. "Grandma," Tyler said again, louder this time. "That is really you." No one laughed this time. Ashley's smile had disappeared completely. Daniel stood slowly from his chair, his eyes moving between the screen and the corner where I was sitting beside the booster seats and cartoon placemats. On the television, the reporter began listing numbers. Thousands of students. Hundreds of schools. Libraries in rural communities. It sounded much bigger when someone else said it out loud. I had never liked hearing the numbers myself. For 20 years I had written checks quietly and asked the foundation to keep my name out of the announcements. I had always believed that help should feel like kindness, not publicity. But tonight, apparently, someone had decided the story was worth telling. The reporter's voice grew slightly warmer. After years of anonymity, Margaret Collins has agreed to appear live tonight to discuss the program that changed so many lives. At the adults' table, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Daniel had taken a step toward the living room doorway. Ashley had not moved at all. She simply stared across the room at me as if she was seeing a completely different person than the one she had set to sit at the children's table just a few minutes earlier. I remained seated for another moment, watching the flickering television light reflect in the window beside Tyler's crayons. Then I placed my napkin neatly on the edge of the small plastic table and stood up slowly, smoothing the sleeves of my sweater the way I had done before every parent-teacher conference for 35 years. For several seconds nobody spoke. The only sound in the house was the calm voice of the reporter continuing to explain the story unfolding on the television. The camera on the screen shifted from the old photograph to footage of a small brick school building somewhere in Ohio, then to a library in Arizona where students sat studying beneath a plaque that read Collins Community Reading Center. I recognized each place immediately. I had visited most of them quietly over the years, never staying long enough for anyone to connect my face with the name on the building. At the children's table, Tyler looked up at me with wide eyes that carried none of the confusion or calculation filling the adults' faces across the room. "Grandma," he said slowly, as if testing the idea out loud, "did you build those schools?" I smiled at him gently. "Not exactly," I said. "I just helped some people get started." Across the room, Ashley finally pushed back her chair. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor in a way that made every head turn. She walked halfway toward the living room, her eyes fixed on the television where the reporter was now describing the Collins Education Fund and the thousands of scholarships it had quietly provided over the last 2 decades. "That cannot be right," she said softly, though she was not speaking to anyone in particular. Daniel was standing beside the dining table now, his hand resting on the back of his chair as if he had forgotten why he stood up in the first place. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain. It was the first time he had spoken directly to me since I arrived. I looked at him calmly. For years I had grown used to the small distance that had slowly formed between us after his marriage, the way conversations had become shorter, the way invitations arrived less often. I had told myself it was simply the natural rhythm of families changing and children building their own lives. Still, seeing his expression now reminded me of the boy who once asked endless questions at my kitchen table while doing homework after school. On the television, the reporter continued speaking. The Collins Education Fund has supported more than 4,000 students in all 50 states. Until tonight, the donor insisted on remaining anonymous, saying that recognition was not the purpose of the work. Ashley turned toward me then. Her expression had changed from disbelief to something more complicated, something that looked like careful calculation. "Margaret," she said, suddenly using my name with a politeness that had not existed 20 minutes earlier, "why did you never mention any of this?" I folded my hands together lightly in front of me, the same quiet posture I had used for years while listening to nervous students explain unfinished homework. "It was never really something to mention," I replied. "Helping people does not require an announcement at dinner." The television camera shifted again, this time to a studio where a host sat behind a desk beneath bright lights. "In just a few minutes," he said, "Margaret Collins will join us live to speak about the program that has changed so many lives." A long silence settled across the dining room. I could feel every pair of eyes in the house turning toward the small table by the window where I had been sitting with the children. For a moment no one moved. Then Daniel spoke again, more carefully this time. "Mom," he said, clearing his throat, "you should probably come sit with us at the main table." I glanced at the long table covered in candles and polished glasses, then at the small plastic table beside Tyler's crayons and paper placemats. After a moment I gave a gentle smile and stepped away from the children's chairs, walking slowly toward the living room where the television lights flickered against the walls. The television glow filled the living room with a pale blue light as I stepped across the hardwood floor. Every movement in the house seemed slower now, as if the entire evening had quietly shifted onto a different path. Behind me I could hear chairs sliding back from the dining table as Daniel and Ashley followed a few steps, though neither of them spoke. The reporter on the screen had finished the segment and the studio host now sat beneath bright lights, reviewing photographs from different schools and community centers that had received support from the Collins Education Fund. I recognized nearly every building that appeared. There was the small library in rural Montana where the town had only one stoplight and a grocery store that closed at 6 in the evening. There was the community center in Louisiana where students studied at long wooden tables while ceiling fans turned slowly above them during humid summer nights. Each place represented years of quiet decisions, small checks mailed from my kitchen table, and careful planning after retirement when I finally had time to think about what might help children who grew up in towns that looked a lot like the one where I had taught for 35 years. Daniel stopped a few feet behind me. I could feel his presence without turning around. "Mom," he said softly, the words sounding unfamiliar after so many evenings where we spoke mostly about weather or traffic or nothing at all. "Why did you never tell us about any of this?" I watched the television for a moment before answering. "Because it was never supposed to be about me," I said calmly. The host on the screen began explaining how the foundation started with a small investment account and a promise that one teacher had made to herself after watching too many bright students struggle to afford college tuition. That part of the story always sounded much simpler when reporters said it out loud. The truth was quieter and slower than television stories preferred. It began the year after my husband Robert passed away. I had spent 35 years teaching English and history in the same brick school building where generations of families passed through my classroom. Every spring I watched seniors talk about their dreams for the future. Some wanted to become engineers. Some hoped to study medicine. Others simply wanted a chance to attend college somewhere beyond the county line. Too often the conversations ended with the same quiet sentence. "It costs too much." After Robert died, the house became very still in the evenings. I began reviewing the savings we had built together over decades of careful budgeting, modest vacations, and the kind of small financial discipline that teachers learn out of necessity. One night I realized something simple. The money sitting quietly in those accounts could remain there for the rest of my life without changing anything important for me. Or it could become an opportunity for someone else. So I started small. One scholarship for a student in Cedar Ridge. Then another the following year. The foundation grew gradually as careful investments expanded the fund. I never saw a reason to speak about it at family dinners or holiday gatherings. On the television. The host adjusted his papers and smiled toward the camera. And in just a moment, he said, "We will speak directly with Margaret Collins about the work that has helped thousands of students across the United States." Ashley moved closer now, standing beside Daniel near the doorway. The change in her posture was unmistakable. Earlier that evening she had directed me politely toward the children's table as if placing an extra chair out of the way. Now she watched me with careful attention, the way people look at someone they are trying to understand for the first time. I remained standing in front of the television, my hands folded comfortably in front of me as the studio lights brightened on the screen and the host prepared to introduce the live interview. The host on the television straightened the papers on his desk and looked directly into the camera with the practiced calm of someone who had delivered thousands of introductions before. Joining us now from Cedar Ridge is the woman behind the Collins Education Fund, Margaret Collins. For a moment the room around me felt very quiet again. The screen shifted to a smaller frame where my own face appeared through a simple video connection, recorded earlier that afternoon from the study in my home. I had agreed to the interview after weeks of careful conversation with the foundation board, though I still felt a little uncomfortable seeing my name spoken aloud like a headline. The host smiled politely. "Margaret, thank you for speaking with us tonight. For 20 years you insisted on remaining anonymous. Why choose to step forward now?" The woman on the screen, the version of me recorded earlier that day, folded her hands the same way I was doing now in Daniel's living room. "Because the story was never supposed to be about one person," I heard myself say. "It was about teachers who see potential in their students and communities that believe education can open doors." Behind me I heard Ashley shift slightly, the soft sound of her shoes moving across the hardwood floor. Daniel had moved closer as well, standing just behind the couch where the television light reflected across the glass coffee table. The host continued. "Our research shows that the Collins Education Fund has helped more than 4,000 students attend college over the last 2 decades. That is a remarkable number. What first inspired you to begin?" On the screen my earlier answer played calmly. "I spent most of my life in a classroom. When you teach long enough you begin to notice patterns. Some students arrive with every opportunity waiting for them. Others arrive with determination but very little support. I wanted to create something that might balance those chances just a little." The host nodded thoughtfully. "And you did all of this quietly for 20 years. "Yes," I replied on the screen. "Kindness often works best when it does not need applause." The camera in the interview shifted to photographs of students graduating, shaking hands with school principals, holding scholarship certificates in front of small-town libraries and community centers. The host spoke again while the images passed by. "The Collins Education Fund has also supported library construction and reading programs in rural communities across the United States. Tonight we want to recognize not only the financial support but the philosophy behind it." I watched the images calmly while the house behind me remained almost completely silent. Somewhere in the dining room a chair creaked softly as someone shifted their weight. The host returned to the camera. "Margaret, before we let you go, there is one more announcement. The National Education Alliance has selected you as this year's recipient of the Lifetime Community Impact Award. The ceremony will take place next month in Washington, District of Columbia." On the screen I smiled politely, clearly surprised even in the earlier recording. "That is very kind of them," I said. "But the real celebration belongs to the students." The interview ended with a brief thank you from the host and a final photograph of the Collins Education Fund logo. The television returned to the studio lights and evening news graphics. For a moment no one in the living room moved. Then Tyler's voice carried softly from the dining room doorway where he had wandered closer to watch. "Grandma," he said with simple admiration, "you are famous." I turned slightly and gave him the same warm smile I had given him earlier at the small table by the window. "No," I said gently. "I am just a teacher who kept her promise." Behind me Daniel cleared his throat quietly, and Ashley stood very still as the television light faded back into the warm glow of the Thanksgiving candles still burning at the dining table. For several seconds after the television returned to the regular evening news, no one spoke. The soft sound of the anchor reading other headlines drifted through the living room, but the words barely registered in the quiet space. The Thanksgiving candles still flickered on the dining table behind us, casting warm reflections across the polished plates and half-filled glasses. I could feel the weight of the room shift, not suddenly, but slowly, like the moment when a classroom grows silent because students realize something important has just happened. Daniel finally stepped closer, his expression still carrying the stunned look of someone trying to rearrange years of assumptions in his mind. "Mom," he said again, more carefully this time, "why did you never tell us any of this?" I turned slightly so I could see both him and Ashley standing beside the doorway. For a long moment I simply looked at them, remembering the many dinners we had shared in this house over the past several years. Conversations about weather, traffic, grocery prices. The small details families use when deeper subjects are quietly avoided. "Because it never seemed necessary," I said gently. "The work was never meant to change how people treated me." Ashley shifted her posture immediately when I said that. Her shoulders straightened and the careful politeness returned to her voice, though this time it carried a noticeable softness. "Margaret," she said, choosing each word with more attention than earlier that evening, "you should come sit at the main table now. Dinner is getting cold." I glanced past her toward the long dining table where the candles were still burning beside the turkey platter and bowls of cranberry sauce. Just 30 minutes earlier that table had been reserved for the adults while I sat beside Tyler's crayons and plastic placemats in the corner. The memory did not hurt as much as it simply clarified things. People often reveal their assumptions in small moments. "Thank you," I replied calmly, but I was quite comfortable where I was. Tyler walked into the living room then, his small sneakers tapping lightly across the floor as he looked from the television back to me with open admiration. "Grandma," he said proudly, "you helped thousands of kids go to college." His voice carried none of the careful tension filling the adults' conversation. I crouched slightly so I could meet his eyes. "They helped themselves," I told him warmly. "All I did was make the door a little easier to open." Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly, a gesture he used to make when balancing complicated decisions at work. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "None of us did." I nodded once. That was the point. Across the room Ashley looked toward the dining table again as if trying to restart the evening. "Well," she said, forcing a brighter tone, "now that everything is out in the open we should celebrate. This is incredible news." I could hear the effort in her voice. The house that had felt so certain about its seating arrangements earlier now seemed unsure where anyone should stand. I straightened and walked slowly back toward the dining room doorway where the children's table still sat beside the window. The small plastic chair I had used earlier remained slightly pulled away from the table. I rested my hand lightly on the back of it. "It was a lovely Thanksgiving dinner," I said calmly, looking around the room once more before turning toward my coat in the hallway. "But I think it is time for me to head home." I paused in the hallway with my hand resting on my coat, listening to the quiet that had settled across the house. A few minutes earlier the rooms had been full of cheerful noise, plates clinking and people laughing while the smell of roasted turkey filled the air. Now the atmosphere felt different, as if the entire evening had been gently turned in another direction. Behind me I heard Daniel take a step forward. "Mom, wait," he said quickly. His voice carried a mixture of confusion and urgency that I had not heard from him in years. I turned slightly and saw him standing near the dining room doorway, his shoulders tense, as if he was trying to decide what the right words should be. Ashley stood beside him, her expression carefully composed, though the confident tone she had used earlier in the evening had disappeared. "You do not have to leave," Daniel continued. "Dinner is ready. We should all sit down together." I looked past him toward the long dining table where the candles were still burning. The food remained exactly where it had been before the television announcement interrupted the meal. Plates waited patiently beside polished forks and glasses filled with cider. For a moment it looked almost like a photograph of a perfect holiday dinner. Then my eyes drifted to the corner near the window where the small children's table remained. Tyler had returned to his seat there and was watching the adults with the open curiosity that only children possess. The colorful paper placemats and plastic cups looked almost cheerful beneath the warm light of the room. "Thank you, Daniel," I said calmly, "but the evening has already been very full." Ashley stepped forward then, speaking quickly as if she was trying to smooth over a situation that had slipped beyond her control. "Margaret, earlier I was only joking about the seating arrangement," she said with a small nervous laugh. "You know how chaotic holidays can be." I met her eyes gently. "Yes," I said. "They can be." For a moment she seemed unsure how to respond to that simple answer. Daniel glanced toward the television again, where the news had moved on to weather forecasts and traffic updates. The bright studio lights no longer carried my name across the screen, yet the effect of those few minutes remained in the room like a quiet echo. "Mom," Daniel said more softly now, "I should have paid more attention. I did not realize what you had been doing all these years." His voice sounded sincere, and I believed that he meant the words. Life has a way of pulling people into their own routines, their own responsibilities, until the quiet work of others becomes invisible. I had seen the same thing happen many times in classrooms where the loudest voices often received the most attention while the patient students worked silently in the background. "You have been busy building your life," I replied kindly. "That is how it should be." Tyler suddenly jumped down from his chair and ran across the room with the simple determination of a child who had reached a clear conclusion. He wrapped his arms around my waist and looked up with bright admiration. "Grandma, you are the coolest person I know," he said proudly. The sincerity in his voice made me laugh softly. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Thank you, Tyler," I said. "But the most important thing you can be is kind." I reached for my coat again and slipped it over my shoulders while the quiet house watched. "Please enjoy your dinner," I added calmly. "The turkey smells wonderful." Then I opened the front door and stepped out into the cool November air, where the night felt calm and honest in a way that busy rooms sometimes forget. The cool November air wrapped around me the moment the front door closed behind my back. The house lights glowed warmly through the windows, and for a moment I could see silhouettes moving inside, people shifting around the dining table that had seemed so certain about where everyone belonged earlier that evening. I walked slowly down the front steps and across the driveway where fallen leaves rustled lightly beneath my shoes. The night smelled faintly of wood smoke and distant fireplaces, the kind of quiet autumn air that makes small towns feel peaceful after a busy holiday dinner. I unlocked my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. Through the windshield I could still see the soft light shining from Daniel's living room window. Inside that house the evening would continue in a different tone now. Conversations would sound more careful. Chairs might be rearranged. Someone might quietly move the small children's table away from the window before dessert was served. I did not feel angry as I sat there. Teaching had given me many years to understand how people behave when they assume they know someone completely. Sometimes it takes a single unexpected moment for those assumptions to change. After a minute the front door opened again and Daniel stepped outside, pulling his jacket around his shoulders against the cold air. He walked down the driveway quickly until he reached the driver's side of the car. I lowered the window halfway. His breath formed small clouds in the chilly night. "Mom," he said, still slightly out of breath, "I did not want you to leave like that." I studied his face under the porch light. He looked older than I remembered from earlier holidays, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been when he was younger and homework papers used to cover my kitchen table. "You have a full house tonight," I said gently. "Your guests should not be waiting for you outside." He shook his head slowly. "They will understand. I just wanted to say that I am proud of you." The words seemed to surprise him as he spoke. them, as if they had taken years to find their way out. I smiled softly. Thank you, Daniel. For a moment neither of us spoke. Somewhere in the distance a car passed along the quiet street, its headlights sliding briefly across the parked vehicles in the driveway. Finally he asked the question that had clearly been on his mind since the television broadcast. Why did you choose tonight to let the story come out? I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel before answering. I did not choose the timing, I said calmly. The foundation board felt the students deserved recognition for what they have achieved. The story belongs to them. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that explanation the way people do when they realize an answer is simpler than they expected. He glanced back toward the house where warm laughter had begun to return faintly through the open door. Will you come back inside? He asked quietly. I looked once more at the house, then at the clear sky above the neighborhood where a few early winter stars had begun to appear. Not tonight, I said gently. But there will be other dinners. I started the engine and the car hummed softly beneath me. Daniel stepped back as I rolled the window up again. When I pulled away from the driveway I caught one last glimpse of Tyler standing in the doorway behind his father, waving enthusiastically into the night as the quiet street welcomed me home. The road home was quiet that night. Most houses along Maple Street were glowing with warm Thanksgiving light, families finishing dessert or gathering in living rooms while football games murmured from televisions. I drove slowly through the familiar streets of Cedar Ridge, passing the small grocery store on the corner and the old brick school building that still stood 2 blocks from my house. The parking lot was empty now, but the tall windows of the classrooms reflected the pale yellow streetlights just as they had for decades. For 35 years that building had been the center of my days. I had watched students arrive nervous on their first day of middle school and leave 3 years later with taller voices and bigger plans for the future. Some went on to universities across the country. Others stayed in town, building lives that were quieter but just as meaningful. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment as the night settled around the house. My porch light switched on automatically, illuminating the small front yard where the last leaves of autumn had gathered near the steps. The house was silent when I unlocked the door, the kind of peaceful quiet that had become familiar since Robert passed away. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the pie I had baked earlier that afternoon. I set my coat on the chair and poured a glass of water before sitting at the small wooden table near the window. The evening replayed in my mind, not as a painful memory but as a reminder of something I had understood for many years. Recognition can change the way people look at you, but it does not change who you have been all along. The work that mattered had already been done long before a television camera ever spoke my name. Somewhere across town Daniel and his family were probably finishing their Thanksgiving dinner now, the candles burning lower beside plates that had finally been moved around the table. Perhaps the small children's table had been folded and placed back in the closet. Perhaps Ashley was explaining the news broadcast to curious relatives who had only heard part of the story. And Tyler was almost certainly telling everyone that his grandmother helped thousands of students go to college. The thought made me smile. I finished my glass of water and looked out the window toward the quiet street where a few distant porch lights flickered beneath the cool November sky. Tomorrow morning I would return to the ordinary routines that had always grounded my life. There were letters to read from scholarship recipients, foundation meetings to attend, and plans to review for the next group of students whose applications would arrive in the spring. The work would continue exactly as it always had, quietly and steadily, because that was how it had always been meant to happen. Respect, I had learned long ago, does not need to be demanded or announced. It simply reveals itself in the moments when people finally see the truth that has been standing quietly in front of them all along.